on the screen that there's a page number at the bottom right-hand side of each slide, or most slides. So if you get lost, you can look down there and see what page we're on. Go to that page. If that doesn't work, raise your hand and say, Charlie Brown, where are you? Anyway. And we'll just be that informal, and we'll try to take everyone along with us. I'd like to suggest that my clicker should work, is what I want to suggest. So the question is, Phil, why isn't it? It's turned on, and I push the button. There we go. I'd like to suggest a couple of objectives for you. There is much more material in this presentation today and tomorrow morning than you'll remember. I hope you'll take this seminar guide like a Sabbath School Quarterly. Write on it. Make it your own. It has fill in the blanks. You can come back and read Bible verses that we're not going to have time to turn to. It's replete with Scripture, but we're probably not going to take very much time to read the actual Scriptures. Most of them you're very familiar with. But I'd like to have you focus your attention on a couple of objectives in order to get the most out of it. Number one, find a few areas for personal growth, because you can't learn everything. And if you came here today with the idea, well, I'm hoping John or Mary come today because they need this material, you're going to miss the boat. You can't do anything about John or Mary or whoever. All you can do is, by God's grace, say, Lord, if I need to change, change me. So look for just a few areas of personal growth. There may be more in here than you're comfortable with applying to yourself even. You may feel overwhelmed. But if you can just find a couple of areas where you can grow in grace in the Lord Jesus Christ, then you will be blessed and the church will be blessed also. Secondarily, this is a new tool for ministry that your church could use in the future. You're going to have copies of it. You can hold another seminar quietly. You can have a Sabbath school group that studies it more in detail, and I have more material that they can study. A number of churches have found it very beneficial to have a Sabbath school class studying this kind of material on a periodic basis. So there's more than just what you might think of in a 1 or 2 day seminar. So let's turn to page 4 and start in. You're familiar with the verse that's on the screen, Matthew 18:20, that says, where 2 or 3 are gathered together. You're so familiar with it, you can even finish it. Tell me, what does it say? Where 2 or 3 are gathered together, Pastor says, there will I be also. Pastor, I'm here to tell you that what it says is, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there shall be conflict. No, he's right. What it really says is, there am I in the midst of them, or there I will be also, depending on the passage that you're reading, the version you're reading from. But isn't it true that where 2 or 3 people are gathered together, there's going to be conflict? And I say that's why the Lord said he would be there in the midst, because he knew he would be needed, right? In fact, one man said to me, Charlie, I don't need anybody else. I can have a fight with myself. Maybe you've heard the story about the man who was shipwrecked on a lonely Pacific island for several years before he was rescued by a passing ship. And as they picked him up, he said, hey, I want to show you around a little bit. So they took a tour of his island, and they saw the grass-thatched hut where he lived, and then they saw a building over here, and they said, what's that building? He says, that's my church. Okay. They went a little bit further through the jungle, and here was another thatched roof building. What's that building? Well, that's my new church. Why do you have a new church? Well, we had a congregational fight, and we had to have his church split. The only man in the congregation, and he had to have a fight. Well, we smile at ourselves, but conflict is just a part of life. In fact, I would suggest to any congregation that if you don't experience some congregation, you are not doing anything, because activity and change brings conflict. If you are doing things the same old way year after year after year and everybody's content, you are not fulfilling the gospel commission. There were a few years back when church planting was a very popular theme in North Pacific Union. I was part of the union at that time, and my colleague, Ron, who was part of the church planting team, and I were talking one day, and I said, Ron, keep planting churches. It gives me a lot of business in conflict management. Because new things generate conflict. New ideas meet resistance. Conflict is not the issue, my friends. Conflict is not a negative word even, necessarily. We usually see it that way. It's a matter of how we relate to conflict. That's where the challenge comes. That's where the tension comes, where this benefit is met, is how we can relate to it. So, at the top of page 4, there's a text. All this is from God, Paul says, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, and he gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Notice that this is Paul's writing to the Corinthian church. And if you want to feel good about your church, read about the Corinthian church. And no matter how bad you think your church is, you'll find that it's pretty good compared to the Corinthian church. Because chapter after chapter after chapter, Paul is having to address issues with the Corinthian believers. And when he comes to chapter 5 of second book, he says, look, folks, all of this, and I think he's saying basically what I've counseled you all the way through in my letters. All of this is from God, who's reconciled us, and it's been through Jesus Christ that he's reconciled us, and he gave us a ministry, people, church members in Corinth. He said he gave us a ministry of reconciliation. And I want to differentiate the ministry of reconciliation from what we often think of as spiritual gifts. Because sometimes people think of peacemakers as a spiritual gift. A spiritual gift is what God gives to each of us through the Holy Spirit, and we each have differing gifts, some of us, of course, having the same gift. And we know that God's plan for the spiritual gifts is to come in, and as we come together, we pool our gifts together, so to speak, and because of the united strength the spiritual gifts give us, the church of God moves forward. The ministry of reconciliation is not like that. He didn't gift me or Pastor Ron or Brother Roger or anybody else with a gift of reconciliation. It is a ministry that he gave to us. We are all to be peacemakers. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be what? Do you remember that particular one? If you're like me, you get them all mixed up. For they shall be called the sons of God. Or they could be called the daughters of God, we can say. Now, this is an interesting thing to consider, because that's almost like an equation. You could flip that around and say, blessed are the sons of God, for they shall be peacemakers. You could almost, if you're daring enough, say, how dare you call yourself a Christian unless you're a peacemaker? That's pretty serious stuff, isn't it? But Jesus said, if you're going to be sons of God, you're going to be a peacemaker. Now, Ron, bless his heart, he was pretty kind to me in his introduction. With a name like mine, I get very interesting introductions. He stopped short of saying, Charlie Brown, he's a good man. And I wouldn't have minded even if he did. With a name like mine, I get interesting comments, and there's a lot of us around. Every community I've ever lived in has several Charlie Browns. And occasionally we even get to meet each other and talk about our name. But while I don't mind the name Charlie Brown, my mother hated it, by the way. She didn't like nicknames. But while I don't mind it, I can't think of any other introduction I would rather have that would be better than, here's Charles Brown. He's a peacemaker. He's a son of God. What a compliment, eh? That's what we should strive for. We should all strive to be that way. All right, let's take a look at understanding conflict and how we respond to it. There are items that are on the screen, as this one is, and each of these on-the-screen items has a little laptop icon or whatever that is, a TV screen icon to the left. So when you see that, you can see that that's likely going to be on the screen, and it should have a fill in the blank for you. The statement above this one says, there is no work more sacred for Christians than to maintain peace among themselves. That's why I make no apologies for having this seminar during the sacred hours of Sabbath school and church service and throughout the Sabbath day. There is no work more sacred than for Christians to maintain peace among themselves. And when we get involved in destructive conflict, it causes people to lose credibility. We lose credibility in the minds of others. How many young people could you count in this congregation who have taken a look at your congregation through the years and they have chosen to vote with their feet and walk because they say, our parents, our aunts and uncles, our other members talk about love and peace and unity, and then they come together and fight like cats and dogs? I don't mean that derogatory of your congregation because I don't know anything about your congregation yet. I just know you're people. And I know that that scenario happens in so many churches across the land. The young people see the lack of credibility. They see us teaching and talking about love and unity, and we don't do anything about it. And they say, I don't need this. They walk. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. Notice what Jesus said here in John 13, verse 35. By this all men will know that you are my disciples. How? If you love one another. Now, we love the Sabbath, we love our 2,300 days and other prophecies. We love and appreciate the comfort, the message of the state of the dead. But that is not the important thing about the church. That is not what sells the church with credibility. It's the love for one another that makes the difference. This statement from Ellen White says, our unity and our love for one another are the credentials by which we testify to the world that God has sent his Son to save sinners. Now, those of you that are well acquainted with the Adventist organization know that every Adventist minister carries ordination credentials. In case anybody questions if he's legit, he can show his credentials. I carried those all through my career. There were only 2 times when I was ever asked to show them. Had nothing to do with coming in as a guest speaker or anything. One was to show them to a hospital so I could be on the list of appropriate chaplain visitations. And the other one was to the federal penitentiary in Walla Walla to visit the inmates there. So let's just take the inmate visit that I made in Walla Walla one time as an example. In maximum security. Oh, I hate to go through all of those locked doors and those hollow-sounding halls. It just sends shivers up my spine. But finally, we get into the visitation room. He's sitting there on the other side of the glass, has the phone to his ear. I have the phone to my ear. What is there, if anything, that convinces that prisoner that I love him as a fellow Christian? Because I'm there, present with him, I take the time to spend with him. It is certainly not the credential I have in my wallet that I had to give to the officers to be on his list, right? He knows nothing about that. The only thing that's going to convince him is the time that I invested in ministering to him on a one-to-one level. Did you know that love is not spelled L-O-V-E? Got a surprise for you. And even Diane, as a school teacher, I'm going to teach her something today. Love is not spelled L-O-V-E, Diane. It's spelled T-I-M-E. Try convincing anyone that you love them without spending T-I-M-E with them, and you won't get anywhere, right? So it's our love that makes the difference. Okay, let's take a look at what conflict is. But after that, before that, I want to show you this little poem. I wrote this when we were working in BC, and I spent some time up in the far north country. 2 little porcupines on a cold winter's night went searching for warmth to end their plight. For hours they had searched when they found each other. Warmth and companionship, almost as good as mother. So down the small hole in anticipation they hurried, nose to nose, then tail to tail. Anticipation turned to worry. Though they cuddled and snuggled against each other, the best they could do was needle each other. I'm waiting for some biologist to say, Charlie Brown, don't you know that little porcupines don't needle each other? I don't know if they do, but nobody's corrected it yet. But I know that people do, and that's why we study things like this seminar. The closer we come together, we tend to irritate each other because of our differences in age, our differences in education, our differences in work, religious background, gender, whatever. The closer we get, the more obvious our differences are. We rub up against each other, philosophically speaking, and we needle each other. And that's why we need to study how to deal with conflict. Conflict is simply a difference of opinion or purpose that frustrates someone's goals or desires. It is not necessarily bad. In fact, conflict can be very productive and helpful. My wife doesn't travel with me often. Oh, she loves to, and we get along great when she does, but I've just gone too much and somebody needs to keep the home fires burning. But when I got a call to do a seminar in Hawaii, that was a different story. Marjorie wanted to go along, and of course I wanted her to go along too. So we took an extra week beforehand and went to the beautiful island of Kauai, the Garden Island. Is it Kauai or Maui? One of those. Anyway, we spent a week. And every morning we got up and we had a list of things to do on that beautiful island. And it was always more than we could have time for. We could have had a roundabout fight every morning about what we're going to do and ruined our vacation, but we didn't. We used the conflict, the tension, to choose the best from among the good. The only problem with grand resolution like that is she wants to go back and do all of the rest of the things. And of course, I would enjoy doing that too. So conflict is not necessarily bad. We generally think of it that way because we live in a sin-cursed earth, a fallen world, and negative conflict is what gets most of our responses. Take a look at this statement and see what it says to you. Conflict occurs most often in congregations in which there is a deep commitment to the church. Wow. Church conflict? That explains why Seventh-day Adventists can have a good church fight. Because we are a deeply committed people. We teach people from the beginning of Bible studies up until baptism and beyond to think for themselves, follow the Word, don't anybody else think for you. Stand on your own independent thinking and do what God tells you to do, what's right. We get them in the church and then we expect them to agree with each other all the time? Doesn't happen that way. I was 30,000 feet in the air over somewhere in North America, traveling to work with a church and chatting with my seatmate. And you know, when men sit side by side, they talk about their jobs. When women sit side by side, they talk about people, the family. Well, we got around to the point of saying, what do you do for a living? And when he asked me, I said, I'm a mediator. I work with organizations teaching conflict resolution. He said, oh, really? He says, what kind of organizations do you work with? I said, mostly churches, Christian organizations, Christian schools. He said, I would have thought that churches wouldn't have problems with things like that. And I smiled and said, sir, you don't realize it, but you just admitted to me that you don't attend church very often. And he said, you got me, you're right. Anybody that knows that churches and other volunteer organizations have conflict as much or more as any other because they are people. Where people are, there will be conflict. And when it has to do with our commitment, our philosophy, our fundamental core beliefs, we will go to the mat to defend what we believe to be right. Correct? Absolutely. That helps us to understand why we have what we have at times. So let's take a look at some of the things that cause conflict. Simple misunderstandings. Have you ever had a spat with your spouse and maybe, I don't know how long you allow them to go on, but maybe it's gone on for a couple of days and you're hardly talking civil to each other, and then you suddenly discover some way, when you finally sit down to talk, that it was all based on misunderstanding. That it was not based on fact. You'd gotten a report about something or something, and you end up having a good laugh, and you kiss and make up. That happens. It's true in the Rogers sense. There have been wars between countries fought, and people die because of misunderstandings. The next one is differences in values, goals, gifts, calling, priorities, expectations, even spiritual gifts can get you into conflict. You go onto the church board and somebody who has the gift of helps wants to spend money serving the community and helping people. Somebody else on the board says, well, no, we don't need to have enough money for that. We need to be fixing the roof or doing the septic system or whatever, because their interests, their gifts are different. Not because either one is bad, it's because they have different interests and they see things differently. I used to show a cartoon on the screen right at this point, but I never could find out how to get legal permission to use it, so I thought I'd better not. So I'll tell you what it said, and you'll catch the picture very easily. An elderly lady is returning a set of eyeglasses to her optometrist. And she says, Doctor, I'm returning these glasses I got for my husband because he's still not seeing things my way. So because of our different backgrounds and all kinds of reasons, we see things differently. The third thing that causes conflict. Competition over limited resources. Well, what kind of resources are we talking about? Well, let's just list some of them. What kind of resources can create conflict, whether it be in the home, at work, at church, whatever? Let's give us a list. Somebody start us out. Money. Strange that we should start there. And time. And people. And how about space? And energy. Resources. We could go on. Limited resources are always a problem. The text in Genesis 13, 1-12, is the story of Abraham and Lot. What was it that divided their families and caused them to go their separate ways? It was water and grazing, because their flocks had grown. Now, we live out west. I grew up in a ranching family, and we all know stories of range wars, and we don't have those kind of wars anymore. Well, don't usually. I have a very good friend whose father was literally shot out of the saddle and killed by a neighboring rancher over a property dispute. And that was not more than 20 years ago. Well, we don't usually have those kind of things anymore, but we do have limited resources, and they create serious conflict. Now, this last one is ones that we would rather not talk about. Sinful attitudes and desires that lead to sinful words and actions. Pastor Ron, you've got a good, strong voice. You have your Bible handy? Would you read James chapter 4, verses 1, 2, 3 for us? And maybe for the sake of the recording, it'd be a good idea if somebody would give him a mic. Or he can come and get it. Now, the setting behind this is James is asking a rhetorical question. He's writing to the church, and he's saying, hey, folks, where's all this stuff coming from anyway? Let's see what he says and see if you can add more to the list after he reads them.
Okay,
James 4, 1-3.
1-3. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war. Yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures.
Okay, so let's list some of the things that he mentioned in that. The underlying surface reasons for disputes among the brethren. Somebody name one that he mentioned. Pleasure. Covetousness. Let's diverge from his list and list other sins of the flesh, sins of the old man. What could we add to it? Perhaps lust, pride, murder. These are sins of the evil heart, the sinful old man nature that we have all had and buried in baptism. We don't like to admit that the old man of sin still wars in our flesh. It's difficult to admit because we know better. We know we shouldn't be saying these things. We know we shouldn't behave this way, but we do. And it's hard to admit that it actually happens and apologize for it. In this seminar, we have 4 different sections that are illustrated or covered by one word at the top of page 5. We call them the 4 G's. We are guided by what God commands us to do with the 4 G's. Number 1 is to glorify God. How can I please and honor the Lord in this situation? That's going to be our topic for the worship service. How do we get the log out of our own eye? That's the most painful part of conflict resolution. And I think it's unique that Jesus used the illustration of getting a log out of your eye. I can't think much of anything more painful than something in that very tender spot of my body. And number 3, then we can go and show your brother his fault. Now that's where a lot of us would like to start. After all, they're at fault, right? So that's where we start. No, that's not what Jesus said. That's the 3rd step. And finally, go and be reconciled. How can I demonstrate forgiveness and encourage a reasonable solution? That's going to be tomorrow morning's topic. I intentionally am saving the best till the last. You don't want to miss tomorrow morning. No matter what you have on the plan. I know Sunday morning is a terrible time to ask Adventists to come together. It takes an act of Congress and several sticks of dynamite to get me off my property if I'm at home on Sunday morning. But tomorrow morning's subject is the most important part of the seminar. So that gives you where we're going on it. Let's take a look now at how we typically respond as human beings, Christian or otherwise. We typically respond to conflict. We have sketched it out in the form of what we call a slippery slope of conflict. Now, I told you that I served many years in British Columbia. What you may not know about the Canadian provinces is that all of the Canadian conferences have a slice of the Northwest Territory, or what is the new name for it, Nunavut? Every conference in Canada goes all the way to the North Pole, in reality. Now, there's not much up there, but there are some native villages, and I used to travel up to the little community of Inuvik periodically, a couple of times a year, and we visited other native villages like Tuktoyaktuk and others. And I saw on several occasions igloos. I didn't know they still used igloos, but they do. They use them like we use tents. For their ice fishing, they'll go out and build an igloo for the winter, and when they go out to ice fish, then they have that shelter to protect them from the storms. This was early April, that time I'm thinking of, and as we came by one igloo, I noticed that it was melting. It would melt in the daytime and then freeze at night as the sun went down over the horizon, and it became a dome of ice. And when I think of the slippery slope, I cannot help but think of that ice, dome-shaped ice called an igloo, and picture myself standing on the top of it in the center. Now, how far could I negotiate from the center of that igloo without getting into a heap of problems? None. You know, it illustrates the fact that we need to stay in the top of this slippery slope of conflict if we're going to follow Christ's principles. Either way we go, we're going to end up with problems. So let's take a look at what the problems are. Let's start on the left-hand side with what we call the escape responses. These are the peacemaking responses, or perhaps I should say the peace-faking responses. They may keep us from having greater conflict, but they don't really generate peace either. So I like to call them the peace-faking responses. The first one is denial. You may think that you don't exercise this response very often, but give me a chance to speak to anybody that's close to you, and I can show you that you do. Because it doesn't have to be overt and very obvious. It can be as sneaky as changing the subject or leaving the room. That's part of the next step we're going to take too. But denial, folks, is not just a river in Egypt. I had to pause for you to get that, didn't I? Denial is a part of the way every one of us responds to conflict at one time or another. And it's usually accompanied by the next step, flight. Let's get out of here. Husband suddenly remembers something he needs to do outside in the yard or in the garage, tinker with the car when his wife wants to talk about something. So he's ready to exit stage left or stage right, either way, just get out of there rather than stay and get involved in a discussion that she wants to engage in. So flight. Now, is flight always bad? Is flight always a negative response? Can somebody think of an illustration or an example when it might be the proper response? If you're not safe, if you're a fear of being endangered, that is exactly right. We list it on the negative side, not because it's always wrong, but because it does not generate any conflict resolution, okay? Can you think of the time when Joseph was in Pharaoh's household, and Pharaoh's or Potiphar's household, Mrs. Potiphar catches him, and they're in the bedroom and has suggestions to make to him about how they ought to spend their time. What if Joseph would have said, now, Mrs. Potiphar, don't you think we ought to sit down here in the bed and talk about this for a while? The story would have been different. No, there's a time to exit, stage right or stage left, get out of there. Because it doesn't generate the exact resolution you need at the moment, it may be the first step to take to keep things from getting worse, right? The ultimate flight response would be suicide. And we're not going to talk about what I call the salvific issues. Can a person be saved when they commit suicide? That's not part of our discussion today. We're simply saying that suicide is the ultimate escape response because you don't get a chance at anything else. When we exercise that option, We don't trust God to bring us through in any other way, because that option is irreversible if we are successful. Now, I have a memory hook that I apply to these peace-faking responses. I call them turtle responses. I have noticed that most people respond one of two ways to conflict in our natural response. We either duck and hide like a turtle, let the winds of strife blow over, and if enough time goes by, we'll stick our head out or a foot out, and is it safe to come back into our little society circle or not? Those are turtle responses. I am a turtle by nature. If any of you are turtles, you're welcome to raise your hand with me and admit that you are a turtle. Let's see how many turtles there are here. Nothing wrong with being a turtle. Hold them up. There's got to be more turtles than that. Okay, I see quite a few of you are. There's nothing wrong. It's just that we often will try to avoid conflict. I hate conflict. Charlie, people say, Charlie, you are in a most unusual line of ministry for somebody that doesn't like to deal with conflict. The reason I'm in my line of ministry is because I love to see reconciliation. That's why I do what I do. All right, let's take a look at the other side of the slippery slope of conflict, the attack responses. First of all, litigation. I had a neighbor when we lived in Southern California that moved up from a place called California, and everything that went wrong in the community, he had an answer for it. He was going to sue them, sue the socks off of them. That was always the answer, litigation. The Bible has something to say about litigation. We're going to look at that tomorrow in our session. And it doesn't say that Christians can never use litigation, but it gives very specific guidelines of how to do to avoid using civil litigation. So we'll talk about that more. Assault is a very specific area of attack responses. But there's several different kinds of assault. Let's see if we can name a few of them. What would one be? Verbal assault. Pastor mentions that even before the physical assault. It is true that words can hurt more than our fists at times. Okay? And can you think of any other kinds of assault besides verbal and physical? Emotional assault. Indifference would be an example of emotional assault. Did I hear several people say spiritual assault? You are an unusual congregation. That doesn't usually come forth. I usually have to bring it, but you're absolutely right. We can assault people in a very deadly way with spiritual assault. Anytime someone wants to get their way in a congregation by withdrawing support because they have means to do it, or because they have the influence to kill a program or whatever, they are using, anytime we use our convictions to force them on somebody else, we are likely guilty of spiritual assault. Gossip could be an emotional form, yes, very likely. In fact, you just reminded me that I skipped over a video that I wanted to show. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm going to pause right now and ask our AV man to cue it up. It's gossiping about gossip. I have never done a Help for Hurting Churches process, but what gossip plays a significant role in issues. So, Brother Phil, let's roll the film Gossip.
Well, sit down. I thought it'd be good if we talked.
That's, Phil, that's the one on repentance.
You want to talk? Are you feeling okay?
We need to
What's
back
the
up
matter
and
with
do
you?
the one
Just
on
forget
gossip.
about it. Forget
Oh, I
it.
was only kidding. What do you want to talk about?
We'll see that one later.
By the way, Phil today is busier than a one-armed paper.
As he cues this one up, I want you to watch for something specifically. There are certain things happening in this little one on gossip that I call seeds for conflict that are going to sprout if something isn't done. So watch for things in this little skit that could generate conflict later on. The one on gossip, it's the number 1 on disc A. I'm glad Phil's the one that has to figure that out. Oh, yes. We're going to talk about that more. When we worked in the conference office in British Columbia, my wife took her turn on the switchboard. And one day, a lady called and asked an appointment to meet with the president. And as a matter of course, she asked, and what would this appointment be about? And she said, I am in a recovery program, and I have learned that as I grew up in the Adventist church, I was a subject of severe spiritual abuse. And part of my assignment for recovery is to go and tell the church what I experienced and tell them I have forgiven them. How does that make you feel about Seventh-day Adventists? Now, I know it's true that it happens. I also know that it doesn't happen carte blanche because of Adventist belief, but it does happen, and we need to be serious about the possibility. Okay?
Well, you don't ask Gina anything, you tell her. She just loves to complain. If you ask her, she'll give you a complete history of all her aches and pains, and then at the last minute, she'll sigh and say she'll go ahead and do it anyway. I know, bless her heart. Yeah, I've heard that. Bless her heart means that she's too dumb to come in out of the rain, but God loves her anyway. We think. Anyway, call Gina and tell her, don't ask her, to make that casserole for the potluck. Uh-huh. Okay. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Who was that?
It was Jill. She's helping me coordinate this Mom's Night Out thing next week. Whew, I think I'm going to need a couple of Mom's Nights Out after this whole thing is over with. Want some chips to go with that monster?
No. Chips would only take away from the artistic integrity of the masterpiece.
Speak of the devil, it's Gina. Oh, I'll be on the phone with her for hours listening to her complaints. I'll just let the machine get it.
Hi, you've reached the Stewart state of confusion. We're all out seeking therapy at the moment. Please leave a message and we'll get back to you. Thanks.
That's a cute message. Made me laugh, I guess. This is Gina. Jill just called and told me you needed a casserole for next week. I've been feeling poorly lately, and I've got those spasms in my back again. But I'll be glad to do it. Listen, the reason I called, I was talking to Nancy yesterday. She seems to be pretty upset about your leadership in the Mothers in Ministry group. And she said that you had taken off.
Hello? Hello, Gina? Hi. Well, I just walked in the door and heard your message and wanted to catch you before you got away. How are you? What's this about Nancy? Uh-huh. Oh, really? Spasms, huh? Oh, you poor thing. You sure do suffer from those things. Well, bless your heart. So, what did Nancy say? Well, I have done my best to try to include her in all these plans. Well, I would have, but... Bossy? She said I was bossy? Well, she just won't help on projects unless you push her a little. Well, I gotta run. Jeff just came home for lunch, and, well, thanks for the info on Nancy. Okay. Well, it doesn't matter. Just any old casserole. Sweet and sour tuna. That sounds just fine. Okay. Well, I gotta go. Okay, thanks again, Gina. Bye-bye. Jeff, do you think I'm pushy?
Well, there are times when...
Never mind. I'll just stop calling on Nancy. That's all there is to it. It's not like I called her that much anyway. It's not like she did that much.
Yeah, isn't there a scripture that says if your brother offends you, write him off your list?
And your point is?
Well, you were ready to write off Nancy because of some remark made by...
Well, you heard what she said.
No, I didn't hear what she said. And neither did you. You just heard some gossip from some woman you'd been gossiping about 5 minutes before.
I was not gossiping. I was only I was sharing my heart.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I get the point. I'll just forget what I heard about Nancy and pretend nothing happened.
Oh, yeah, that always makes for great relationships. Denial and running away.
Don't you have to go back to work? Hello, Nancy. Hey, this is Laura. I was wondering, would you like to have coffee sometime in the next couple of days?
Okay, I heard some chuckles and I saw some smiles during this. What was it in here that you could identify as seeds that could generate into conflict because of the way she was relating? Let's see if we can list some of them. I'm sorry? Not listening carefully. That is true. We don't often listen like we should. What else? Being judgmental. Judging another person's motives or activities without really knowing, just based on gossip. Assumptions. Yes. What else? Lying. Those little white lies. Jeff came in from work. He'd been there the whole time. I just came in and heard the phone, so I got it, and she was there from the very beginning. These little white lies will catch up with us. Sweet and sour tuna. Sweet and sour tuna's got to bring conflict, huh? Okay. Something good out of this. Where's an illustration of a positive response to the scenario that was happening? She was willing to listen to her husband, and he was willing to confront her. Okay? And because she loved him, she was willing to listen to him to a degree at the time, but they were willing to be honest with each other. Yes?
I think an important point, though, that he made it about her. He didn't talk about the other people. He talked to her.
Yeah. Yeah. It was talking about her reaction. She can't do anything about the other people. But he loved her enough to confront her with the attitude that she was expressing. Well, this gives us a lot of food for thought as we move into it. But I want you to know that when we use the term conflict, we are not necessarily using it in a negative way. And when we use the word confront, we're simply talking about coming together to talk things over, okay? My wife and I, when we were in British Columbia, were part of the Marriage Encounter program, and we were a pastoral couple. And we would find occasionally couples that didn't want to go to Marriage Encounter because the word encounter scared them. Like we're going to get in there and duke it all out in one big room or something. And it's simply saying, we're going to have an experience, going to be a positive experience. We're going to come together. We're going to talk. We're going to share with one another in the appropriate sphere and the appropriate way. Okay. We're talking about the attack responses. We got down through the assault responses and spiritual assault. That's when we paused. Let's look at one more assault. The ultimate assault would be murder, right? And I call these the skunk responses. We have the turtle responses where we would rather come and hide and let the winds of strife blow over. Others would rather deal with things. Let's get this on the table and talk it over, right? I don't care if it causes a stink. We need to get this behind us. Now, I have noticed this much in my pastoral experience that people usually marry the opposite. I confess that I'm a skunk. I'm a turtle, rather. A turtle. I married the most beautiful skunk I know. But she's still a skunk, and if she was here, she would smile and nod her head. She wants to talk things over now, and she doesn't care. She just blurt it out. Sometimes I have to say, dear, this is not the place. This is not the time. And this is certainly not the way. And she has begun to listen to me after 53 years. So I think there's hope. Okay, so we have turtles and skunks, and neither are bad. Okay? They're just the way we tend to respond for whatever way. Now, we asked all the turtles to raise their hands. Some of you thinking there may be a trick didn't, but I think there are more turtles there than were raised their hands. Those of you that are skunks don't have to raise your hands. We know who you are now because of turtles. That's a dirty trick, isn't it? But remember, it's not bad to be a skunk. It's not bad to be a turtle. That's the way we tend to respond. The right way are the Christian responses in the middle. The others are our natural human responses. So let's close this session by looking at these Christian responses quickly, and we're going to go over them in detail for the rest of the seminar, so we don't have to take any time specifically. The first one is to overlook. Proverbs 19 says it is a wise man that can overlook an offense. There are things that aren't worth spending the time and the energy and the effort to fight about. Just let it go. Attribute it to a bad hair day or whatever. The next step is to reconcile by talking it over, discuss it, okay? That's the first biblical step. If that doesn't resolve it, then you may have to get some negotiations going in order to resolve it. And I want you to notice that these first 3 steps that are biblical steps can be done with you and the other party. You don't need a third party at all. You don't need a mediator. You don't need an arbitrator. You don't need the pastor. 2 people, husband and wife, 2 children, whatever. 2 neighbors can do these without anybody else involved. It's part of the biblical process. But that doesn't guarantee that it will produce results. We may have to use a mediation. We may have to get a neutral mediator to help us discuss it and find ways to resolve it. And the mediator doesn't decide anything. He simply listens and helps to guide the discussion, and the parties resolve their issues. But that may not necessarily bring resolution either. You may need to move into what is legally called arbitration, where we commit the resolution or parts of the resolution that we cannot agree to somebody else, and they choose how it is going to be decided, and the parties agree to it ahead of time because they know that if they don't, they're going to go into the legal system and they'd rather resolve it without it. So arbitration is very much a definite Christian process that is spelled out in the Bible. Then ultimately, there's the final step of accountability. If nothing else works, there are things like civil law courts. There are things like church boards, church business meetings, family councils, mom and dad making the final decision. In every element of society, when we can't get along and we can't find a solution, the Bible says there is an ultimate body accountable for what happens, and the decision will be made. It may be made by mom and dad, the school principal, school teacher, the school principal, the school board, the civil law courts, whatever. There are things that have to be determined, and if the people involved can't get along and find a solution, someone else will hold them accountable to the answer that has to be found. So that gives you the slippery slope of conflict, and we want to close with this little memory hook. On the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the slippery slope is an acronym, KYRG. KYRG. It's a memory hook to help you to remember that if you use either the escape responses or the attack responses, the result will largely be the same. You can kiss your relationship goodbye. Neither one is going to be successful. The successful steps are what Christ has given us in Matthew and other scriptures, where we come together and we follow his methods of bringing peace into our lives. Well, that's an introduction. We're getting started. The next we're going to look at during the worship service is something that's a strange idea to some people. Can we possibly use conflict in a way that would bring honor and glory to God? Pastor? Yes, a question?
I've only been Seventh-day Adventist for 2 years, and I've seen this in other churches as I've grown up in the Christian church. It seems like we really stop when we get to that board. We're going to go before the board. It's like we're very hesitant to take it to the next level as far as calling in the elders and all that to help solve the problem.
It is true. When it doesn't get resolved by people talking or maybe somebody else sitting down, we're hesitant to move ahead and follow those next steps. But the next steps are biblical. And one of the reasons that we are hesitant to them, my experience has been, is that we have a lack of experience in how to address it on the next level. And because we have not seen successes, we're hesitant to go there. You're right. Pastor Ron.
Pastor Brown. We're going to take about a 10-minute break here at this time, and we'll reconvene, and the children will be joining us. For those of you that may have not caught the schedule yet, they'll be staying with us this morning up through the time of the offering. So we'll say a little bit more about that. We'll be back here promptly at 10 after. Shortly, the organist will continue to play. Diane will play for us, okay, as a little interlude here, all right? Thank you. We'll see you shortly back here.